When is it likely to end? And what is Israel's endgame here? Will it be able to defeat Hamas, which is the stated objective? Will Israel accept a two-state solution? So it's been 2 months since the war between Israel and Hamas began. More than 1,200 Israelis were dead in the deadly October 7 terror attacks. And now, in the resultant Israeli operation, both on the ground and through the air, the Gazan Health Ministry claims that more than 18,000 Palestinians have died. What is the forward movement in this war? When is it likely to end? And what is Israel's endgame here? Will it be able to defeat Hamas, which is the stated objective? If Hamas is defeated, then what replaces it? And most importantly, will Israel accept a two-state solution, which only seems to be the only viable political solution to this crisis? Joining me now is somebody who's tracked this region and, in fact, global affairs for a long, long time now. He's the head of political sciences at the University of Chicago, Professor John Mearsheimer. Thank you very much, Professor Mearsheimer, for speaking with us. Always a pleasure to get your insights into some of the biggest stories in the world right now. And what bigger than the war between Israel and Hamas? It's been going on for 2 months now. There are casualties galore on both sides. It started off with the deadly terror attacks in which over 1,000 Israelis died, and now more than 15,000 Palestinians have died in the resultant attacks by Israel. Now, the question is, how long can this be sustained? When is this war likely to end? The stated military objective by Israel is the defeat of Hamas. Is that achievable? And if it is, then what comes in its place? Because something has got to take the place of Hamas. It cannot be a vacuum.
Well, it's very difficult to say how long the war will continue. When you watch all the horrors in Gaza, you say to yourself, this can't go on much longer. And hopefully that's true, but one cannot say for sure when it will end. The Israelis believe that they can punish the Palestinian population to a point where they will no longer resist the Israeli occupation. And at the same time, the Israelis are convinced that they can defeat Hamas on the ground. They can eliminate Hamas as a threat. I do not think this is possible. I do not think they can defeat Hamas. And even if I'm wrong and Hamas is defeated, another resistance group will pop up to replace it. And furthermore, the Palestinians are not going to submit to an occupation over time. It's just not going to work. There has to be some political solution. There's no military solution to this conflict. The Palestinians really need a state of their own. And absent a state of their own, this will just go on and on. So you ask me what will happen once the shooting starts, once the dust settles. And the answer is that there will be no Palestinian state. The Israelis will not let that happen. And the end result is this conflict will go on and on for the foreseeable future.
Now, one of the things that Israel has been floating is, once they clear out the Gaza Strip as much as is possible, to have some kind of a buffer zone between the Palestinian territories and Israel in a way that Israel can try and control or negate any potential future attack. One of the problems Israel was facing was these repeated rocket attacks from Gaza into mainland Israel. Is it even conceivable that they will be able to create some kind of a buffer zone between Gaza and Israel?
No, I think that the Israelis talk about controlling certain areas inside of Gaza and using those areas as a buffer to protect the Israeli areas that are adjacent to the Gaza Strip. But the problem is that the Israelis then end up occupying Gaza. And as we all know, the Israelis once occupied Gaza. They once had settlements in Gaza. But Ariel Sharon, when he was prime minister, withdrew those settlements and withdrew Israeli forces in 2005. because there was too much resistance inside Gaza, and it made no sense from a cost-benefit point of view for the Israelis to try to hold Gaza. So to go back into Gaza now just recreates the problem that caused Israel to leave in 2005. It doesn't solve the problem. Again, this problem is not going to be solved until there's a political solution that satisfies the Palestinians. The Israelis are bent on creating a greater Israel. The Israelis, the Israeli government, and the Israeli elites more generally want a greater Israel that includes the West Bank and Gaza Strip. But the problem that the Israelis face is that there are as many Palestinians inside of greater Israel as there are Jews. And when you have a situation like that, the Israelis have no choice but to suppress the Palestinians. And again, the Palestinians will not accept this and they will resist.
So why then, Professor, is the United States and the Biden administration seemingly giving a kind of blank check, if you will, to Israel, despite the fact, and you saw this just last week at the UN Security Council, the United States was the only country that vetoed the proposal for an immediate ceasefire. Even in the General Assembly, when the vote is happening tonight, a majority of the countries of the world, over 100 of them, are asking for an immediate ceasefire. America seems to be this lone ranger amongst the big powers in the world that is completely and almost unequivocally supporting Israel. Why is that?
Well, the fact is that the United States is joined at the hip with Israel. These two countries have a remarkably close relationship. It's unprecedented in history. And the question is, why is that the case? And the answer is very simple. It's because pro-Israel forces, or what is commonly known as the Israel lobby here in the United States, is so powerful that it makes it almost impossible for any president to contest Israel on issues relating to the Palestinians. So we basically have a case here where no matter what the Israelis do to the Palestinians, the Americans will back them. And this is what you saw happen with regard to this Security Council resolution, where, as you say, the United States was the only country that was willing to back Israel's behavior in the Gaza Strip and not push for a ceasefire.
So has it also got to do with domestic politics, and particularly when a Democrat is in the White House? How difficult would it be for him to be seen as not supportive or supportive enough of Israel, because the Republicans will make that into a big issue? Or is this an issue that is bipartisan in nature in the United States? Domestically, does domestic pressure explain why America is really giving this long rope to Israel?
Oh, I think domestic politics explains it almost completely. And this gets back to my point about the Israel lobby. The Israel lobby in action is domestic politics at play. Your question is, do we see even more emphasis on domestic politics in an upcoming election year? And I would argue no. I would argue that regardless of whether it's an election year or not, the United States government, whether it's Bill Clinton or Joe Biden or George Bush or Donald Trump, is going to support the Israelis down the line. It's just the way it works in American politics. And this is why you have this anomalous situation where every other country in the world is anxious to put an end to this war because it's so horrible. But the Americans are backing the Israelis completely.
So that brings me to my next question. There is already one war that's going on between Russia and Ukraine. Now you have a new war between Israel and Hamas, and America is pretty much funding both of these wars. Many are asking the question, can America handle, fund, support these two wars simultaneously? In fact, President Zelensky is in the United States this week. Just last week, the Republicans blocked an attempt for further funding Ukraine's war effort. There seems to be flailing interest in the Ukraine war, certainly on Capitol Hill amongst the Republican caucuses. Can America continue to support both Ukraine and Israel in the same fervor that it's been doing for some time now?
Well, I think the situation regarding Ukraine from the Biden administration's point of view is a disaster. I mean, independent of continued U.S. funding for the Zelensky government, the fact is that the Ukrainians are in desperate straits on the battlefield. The Russians are on the march. The Ukrainian army is in deep trouble. If you take that basic fact and you marry it to the fact that it looks like Biden is not going to be able to get any economic aid for Ukraine in the near future, this is a total disaster for Ukraine. It's hard to see how the Ukrainians can continue to fight on the battlefield in any meaningful way. And as things deteriorate in Ukraine, this will be terrible news for the Biden administration, because as you noted, the Biden administration faces not just a conflict in Ukraine, where it's losing, but it also faces a conflict in Gaza, where there is no happy story to tell moving forward, where this terrible situation today looks like it continues on and on. So the Biden administration on the foreign policy front is in terrible shape from the perspective of the 2024 election.
So it's pretty apparent now that Ukraine is not winning this war. Russia clearly has the upper hand in this war. Russia right now controls about 20% of territory of Ukraine, which it did not have control over from when this war began, but now it is in control of. So the only realistic solution, and if there is, flailing interest in supporting the Ukrainian war effort in America by the biggest benefactor of Ukraine, then do you see the only realistic solution or realistic possibility for the end of this war for Ukraine to accept that its borders have changed, the 20% of territory it lost to Russia, it is perhaps lost for good, and that Ukraine gives some kind of a commitment that it's not going to join NATO explicitly? Do you think that's even going to happen?
Well, I think if Ukraine wants to end this war now, they have to accept the fact that Russia will keep the Crimea, and it will also keep the 4 oblasts that it now controls, and this includes the Donbass. At the same time, it's absolutely essential from a Russian perspective that Ukraine abandon its plans to join NATO, and that Ukraine become a genuinely neutral state that has no security ties with the West. The problem here is that it's almost impossible to envision the Ukrainians giving up all that territory, accepting the fact that Russia has annexed Crimea and those 4 oblasts, and that's a fait accompli. And also, it's hard to imagine Ukraine abandoning its plans to join NATO or giving up completely any meaningful security agreements with the West. But if Ukraine doesn't do that, then the Russians will not agree to end this war, because the Russians are on the march militarily, and they will take more territory if they can and do more to wreck Ukraine as a functioning state if they can. So I think there is a solution, which I just described, but from a Ukrainian point of view, that solution is unacceptable. And therefore, I think this war will go on.
I want to come back to domestic U.S. politics for just a second, because we've seen extreme criticism and we've seen protests and counter-protests as well on college campuses across the United States. You had just last week the presidents of some of the biggest universities, most elite universities in the U.S., Harvard, MIT, University of Pennsylvania, testify before Congress, and they couldn't answer, or at least give a simple answer to the question whether calling for a genocide of Jews would violate school rules. They're receiving a lot of flack for that. We're seeing a lot of openly anti-Semitic comments on campuses, sloganeering, which is openly anti-Jews, anti-Israel, anti-Semitic. What would you attribute that to? And more importantly, what may this mean for the Biden administration? Because a lot of these young people, the Democratic Party and Mr. Biden's administration would want out on voting day in 2024, because a lot of these young voters could be leaning Democrat, and yet they are the ones who seem to have the most amount of problem with Biden's almost long rope, blank check, call it what you want, to Israel in this war effort.
Well, it's important to understand that the one place in the United States where criticism of Israel has been abundant are college campuses. That's the one place. And Israel's supporters in the United States have long paid serious attention to the question of how to shut down criticism of Israel on college campuses. And what's going on now is that the Israel lobby, and this is basically supporters of Israel, are telling this story that university and college campuses are hotbeds of anti-Semitism. I believe that nothing could be further from the truth. The idea that university and college campuses in the United States are filled with anti-Semites is not a serious argument. What you see on university and college campuses is lots of criticism of Israel. And we've gotten to the point in the United States where criticizing Israel is considered to be anti-Semitism. So when you see criticism of Israel and its behavior in Gaza on college campuses, Israel's supporters will say that's anti-Semitism. It is not anti-Semitism. We should be, and we are free on university and college campuses to criticize the United States, to criticize India, and to criticize Israel. And that's not anti-Semitism. Now, with regard to these three university presidents who testified before Congress and are being lambasted, they were asked a hypothetical question. They were asked if someone called for murdering Jews or genocide against Jews on a college campus, would that be acceptable free speech? So it's a hypothetical question. They were not saying that there is evidence of people making that argument on college campuses. Now, I think it's clear that those three university presidents did not answer the question wisely. They answered it in a ham-fisted way, and they have been severely criticized for it, and they have apologized. But that should be the end of the story. These three women are not anti-Semites, and they're not tolerating anti-Semitism on their campuses. What they tolerate is criticism of Israel. And criticism of Israel is unacceptable to Israel's supporters in the United States. And that's why they have their crosshairs on universities and colleges at this point in time.
And I do want to get a final word from you on what your thoughts are on India's stand when it comes to both of these wars, the Russia-Ukraine war, where again it took a slightly different position from the United States and other Western countries, and even on the Israel-Hamas war, while the Indian Prime Minister was one of the first world leaders to come out and unequivocally condemn the terrorist actions of Hamas. At the same time, India has also stuck to its long-stated position of a two-state solution. So I'm curious to know your thoughts on how India has managed to sort of balance its position on both of these wars, Russia-Ukraine and Israel-Hamas.
Well, I think with regard to Ukraine, as I've said before on your show, I think the Indians are on the right side. I think they're behaving smartly. I think the Indians have understood from the beginning that it was foolish for Ukraine to get into a war with Russia. So I don't have much disagreement at all with India on the question of Ukraine. Gaza is a different matter. I think the fact is that the Modi government admires the Netanyahu government very much, and the Modi government has made it clear that it supports Israel in its war in Gaza. That's not to say that India doesn't want a ceasefire now, but by and large, the Indians have been supporting the Israelis, and that is in large part because Netanyahu and Modi have a great deal in common in terms of how they think about dealing with their body politics.
All right, Professor John Mearsheimer, it's always a pleasure speaking with you, sir. Thank you very much for joining us here on the News 18 Network.